In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic. Every textbook tells you this was the dawn of global exploration. 3 small ships, 90 men. It is a clean, heroic story of Western ambition. But what if I told you that 87 years earlier, an admiral commanded a fleet of 300 floating cities? He led 28,000 men across the known world. And then, at the height of their absolute power, his own government destroyed the ships and burned every single blueprint. This is the buried record, and today we are peeling back the layers on the fleet that could have ruled the world. If you are the kind of person who questions what you have been taught, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. To understand the scale of this historical cover-up, we have to look at how history is framed. Think about how you were taught the Age of Discovery. The narrative is always exactly the same. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe suddenly woke up. Portugal, Spain, and later Britain realized the oceans were highways, not barriers. They built galleons, they mastered navigation, they sailed out and claimed the globe. Western history frames this as inevitable. We are told Europe dominated the seas because they possessed superior technology. They had bolder explorers. They had a unique, inherent drive to conquer the unknown. It is a very comforting story for the West. It makes perfect sense. There is just one problem. None of it is true. While European monarchs were struggling to fund a few leaky wooden boats, an empire in the East had already conquered the oceans, and they did it on a scale that European explorers could not even comprehend. The year is 1405. The Ming Dynasty in China is the most wealthy, powerful, and technologically advanced civilization on Earth. The emperor, Li, wants the entire world to know it. He does not just want to send a diplomatic message. He wants to project absolute, undeniable dominance. So he orders the construction of a fleet. But these were not normal ships. The buried record describes vessels that completely defy maritime logic. Let's put this into perspective. Think of Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria. It was roughly 60 feet long. It was a decent, capable ship for its time. Now, imagine a Chinese treasure ship from 80 years earlier. The historical records state these ships were over 400 feet long. They were massive, floating wooden fortresses. They had 9 masts. They had 4 decks. They featured watertight compartments to prevent sinking. This is a brilliant safety innovation that the European naval powers would not figure out for another 400 years. You could comfortably fit Columbus's entire 3-ship fleet onto the wooden deck of a single Chinese treasure ship. And the Ming Emperor did not just build one of them, he built over 60. To command this staggering armada, the emperor chose a man named Zheng He. Zheng He was not your typical naval commander. He was a Muslim eunuch from a landlocked mountain province, but he was a brilliant military strategist and a fiercely loyal imperial general. In 1405, Zheng He stood at the bow of his massive flagship and ordered the fleet to sail. 317 ships, 28,000 sailors, elite soldiers, doctors, and diplomats. It was the largest naval expedition in human history, and it would remain the largest for another 500 years, right up until the outbreak of the First World War. Over the next 3 decades, this massive armada launched 7 epic voyages. They sailed aggressively through Southeast Asia. They crossed the vast Indian Ocean. They reached the Arabian Peninsula. They even dropped anchor off the coast of East Africa. Think about the sheer logistics of moving that many people. Feeding 28,000 men at sea is a massive challenge today. In the early 1400s, it was considered entirely impossible. But the Chinese had already solved it. They brought specialized supply ships. They towed massive freshwater tankers. They even operated floating farms. They actually grew fresh vegetables on the decks of their ships in soil mixed with animal waste. They did this specifically to prevent scurvy. British sailors were still dying horrific deaths from scurvy in the 18th century. The Ming Dynasty had cured it 300 years earlier. When Zheng He's fleet arrived in a foreign kingdom, the psychological impact was absolutely devastating. Imagine standing on a beach in the year 1410. You look out at the horizon. Suddenly, the ocean is completely covered in carved wood and red silk canvas. The sky goes dark with sails. The fleet was so incredibly massive, it took days for all the ships to finally drop anchor. It was the ultimate display of hard power. The message from the emperor was extremely clear. We are the undisputed center of the world. You will acknowledge our supremacy, or you will face the consequences. And they were not afraid to use violence to back it up. The textbook version sometimes claims these were just peaceful voyages of friendly diplomacy. The evidence tells a completely different story. Zheng He's fleet was heavily armed. They carried advanced gunpowder weapons, bronze cannons, and thousands of elite imperial marines. When a pirate king in Sri Lanka refused to show the proper respect, Zheng He did not bother to negotiate. He landed his troops. He completely destroyed the pirate army. He captured the king, threw him in chains, and brought him all the way back to China. He actively overthrew hostile governments in Sumatra. He installed favorable, loyal rulers across Southeast Asia. This was not a sightseeing tour. It was a highly coordinated, militarized expansion of geopolitical influence. The Ming Dynasty was systematically locking down the most valuable maritime trade routes on Earth. They were operating a massive protection racket, centuries ahead of the European colonial empires. Western historians often dismiss these voyages. They call them simple tribute missions, a massive, overly expensive ego trip for a proud Chinese emperor. They claim Zheng He did not actually discover anything because those Asian and African trade routes already existed. But that is just the surface. The buried record goes deeper. What Zheng He was actually doing was far more strategic. If they had kept going, if they had simply turned those massive ships east across the Pacific or sailed south around the Cape of Good Hope, the entire modern world would look completely different. The history of the Americas would have been written in Chinese. But here is where it gets interesting. And this is where the official story falls apart, because they did not keep going. Right when they held the entire ocean in the palm of their hand, the Ming Dynasty made a decision that still baffles Western historians today. They did not just stop sailing, they actively dismantled their own supremacy. Why would an empire at the absolute peak of global dominance suddenly burn its own boats? To find the answer, we have to look away from the ocean. We have to look inside the imperial court in Beijing. Because the greatest threat to the Ming Dynasty was not a foreign navy. It was a vicious, internal political civil war. The court was heavily divided into two warring factions. On one side, you had the eunuchs. These were the military commanders, the explorers, the men like Admiral Zheng He. They controlled the vast wealth pouring in from the maritime trade routes. They wanted a global, outward-facing empire. On the other side, you had the Confucian scholars. These were the elite bureaucrats who ran the day-to-day government. They were deeply conservative. They believed that agriculture was the absolute foundation of society. To them, foreign trade was a dangerous distraction. It made merchants wealthy, which completely disrupted the traditional social hierarchy. Furthermore, they viewed foreign nations as uncultured barbarians. They believed China had absolutely nothing to learn from the outside world. For decades, the Emperor Yongle kept these two factions balanced. But when the emperor died, the balance of power completely shattered. The Confucian scholars violently seized control of the government policy, and they had a massive economic argument on their side. The treasure fleets were undeniably expensive. At the exact same time Zheng He was sailing, the Ming Dynasty was fighting a massive, costly land war against the Mongols in the north. They were also spending a fortune building a brand new capital city. You might know it as the Forbidden City. The scholars argued that the empire was bleeding silver into the ocean. They needed to focus entirely on defending the Great Wall. So, they made a decision that would permanently alter the course of human history. They did not just defund the navy, they actively erased it from existence. The Eastern Record documents a systematic campaign of historical sabotage. The new emperor, heavily influenced by the scholars, ordered all maritime expeditions to halt immediately. But the scholars went much further. They marched into the imperial archives. They dragged out every single technical blueprint, every navigational chart, and every logbook from Zheng He's 7 epic voyages. And they burned them all. They did this specifically so the eunuch faction could never, ever rebuild the ships. It was a deliberate destruction of their own technological supremacy. But that is just the first layer of the cover-up. The buried record goes deeper. The Ming government did not stop at burning paper. They passed a terrifying series of isolationist laws known as the Haijin, or the sea ban. It became a capital offense to build an ocean-going ship with more than 2 masts. Let that sink in. The civilization that invented the watertight compartment made it legally punishable by death to build a large boat. Coastal trade was completely outlawed. Thousands of brilliant shipwrights, navigators, and sailors suddenly found themselves unemployed and branded as criminals. Many of them were forced to become pirates just to survive. The greatest naval power the world had ever seen essentially locked its own doors and threw the key into the ocean. Now, fast forward 50 years. Let's look at the timeline intersect. This is where the story most people know completely changes its meaning. While the Ming Dynasty was busy burning its own naval blueprints, a deeply impoverished, fractured corner of the world was desperately looking for a way to get rich: Europe. In 1492, Columbus stumbled into the Americas. In 1498, a Portuguese explorer named Vasco da Gama finally figured out how to sail around the southern tip of Africa. He entered the Indian Ocean. Western textbooks treat this as the ultimate triumph of European innovation. But here is what no Western historian will tell you. When the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean, they were incredibly lucky. They did not face a massive Chinese armada. They did not encounter 400-foot wooden fortresses armed with bronze cannons. Because 50 years earlier, the Chinese had voluntarily removed themselves from the ocean. The Portuguese sailed into a massive, unprecedented geopolitical power vacuum. If Vasco da Gama had arrived a century earlier, he would have come face to face with Zheng He's treasure fleet. The European age of discovery would have ended immediately. It would have been crushed at the bottom of the Indian Ocean. The West did not win the race for global naval supremacy because they were smarter, braver, or more advanced. They won because the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world deliberately forfeited the match. This is the ultimate perception overturn. We are taught that history is a straight line of Western progress. The East is framed as a static, isolated backdrop waiting to be discovered. The buried record shatters that illusion completely. The Ming Dynasty possessed the exact same capability to discover Europe, or the Americas, long before Columbus was even born. They had the technology, they had the wealth, they had the logistical brilliance. What they lacked was the political will to stay curious. Every empire believes it is the exception, but history reveals a terrifying, universal pattern. When a civilization reaches the absolute peak of its power, it rarely falls because of a stronger enemy on the outside. It falls because it turns inward. It falls to paranoia, internal political warfare, and the arrogant belief that it no longer needs the rest of the world. The destruction of the Chinese treasure fleet is not just a historical tragedy. It is a massive, lingering warning. When a nation becomes terrified of what lies beyond its borders, it doesn't just build a wall. It actively destroys its own future. When you look at a modern map of the world, when you see Western languages spoken across the Americas, you are looking at the direct result of a political coup in a 15th century Beijing palace. The world looks the way it does today simply because a group of scholars decided to burn a pile of blueprints. Everything you just heard is documented. It is in the historical record. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why weren't you taught this? If this changed how you see the age of discovery, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you want to go deeper, the buried record has a lot more to reveal. Subscribe, and we will keep digging. Their logic was highly ethnocentric. The argument was simple. The greatest European engineers in the 19th century struggled to build wooden ships longer than 300 feet. The massive wooden hulls would bend and snap in the heavy ocean swells. Therefore, if the British could not do it in 1850, the Chinese certainly could not have done it in 1405. The West essentially decided that if they didn't invent it, it simply didn't exist. The history books were written accordingly. Admiral Zheng He was downgraded from a master of the oceans to a minor, exaggerated myth. But the buried record always waits for the evidence to catch up. In the mid-20th century, and again in the early 2000s, archaeologists began digging. They excavated the muddy banks of the Yangtze River in modern-day Nanjing. This was the exact site of the ancient Longjiang shipyards, where the Emperor Yongle ordered the treasure fleet to be built. Deep in the thick river mud, preserved for 6 centuries, they found the physical smoking gun. They unearthed massive, intact wooden rudder posts. These were not normal ship parts. A single wooden rudder post was 36 feet long. It was as tall as a 3-story building. When maritime engineers and naval architects analyzed these massive artifacts, the math was completely undeniable. To successfully operate a steering rudder of that immense size, the ship attached to it had to be exactly what the Chinese records claimed: 400 to 450 feet long. The Ming Dynasty was not exaggerating. They were not writing propaganda. They were simply doing things that Western science would not figure out for another 4 centuries. The watertight compartments were real. The massive supply chains were real. The armada of 300 giant ships was absolutely real. The Western skepticism was nothing more than an intellectual blind spot. It was a failure to imagine that an Eastern civilization could be so far ahead. And this is where the history of 1405 collides directly with the geopolitical headlines of today. If you look at the South China Sea right now, the Eastern record is no longer just a history lesson. It is an active, living blueprint. Today, China is aggressively expanding its maritime power. They are rapidly building the largest naval force on Earth. They are constructing artificial islands and launching advanced aircraft carriers. And they are not looking to the West for inspiration. When Chinese leaders discuss their modern maritime strategy, they explicitly reference Admiral Zheng He. They study his logistics. They rebuild his diplomatic networks across Southeast Asia and Africa. The modern Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a 21st century recreation of the treasure fleet's exact trade routes. The 500-year mistake has been realized. The devastating isolationist policies of the ancient scholars have been officially abandoned. The giant that burned its own boats in the 15th century has finally remembered how to build them again. History is not a straight line of Western destiny. It is a complex web of choices. The European explorers chose to sail across the Atlantic because they were hungry, fractured, and desperate for resources. The Ming Dynasty chose to burn their fleet because they were incredibly wealthy, deeply secure, and terrified of internal change. But power in the modern world does not care about what you did 500 years ago. It only cares about what you remember. When a civilization forgets what made it great, it crumbles from within. But when a civilization unearths its own buried record, it can shift the entire balance of the world. Everything you just heard is documented. It is in the physical, archaeological record. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why weren't you taught this? If this changed how you see the world, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you want to go deeper, there is a whole buried record waiting. Subscribe, and we will keep digging.